Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Something lurks in the shadows. The fall breezes, unusually chilly for this time of year, whip through the opening in the corrugated steel doors of one of the outbuildings at the massive old sugar mill, their unseen fingers seeking out warm spaces to invade before seemingly being sucked back into the night. The autumn harvest was set to begin soon, and the mill was running extended shifts in an attempt to be ready for the onslaught. It was about 8 p.m., and I was working with two other men, Oscar Sam and Gregory Zeno, on an ancient front-end loader that was used to move the brown sugar from the holding bins to the rail cars in the siding. Sam was wizened and over 60, with skin the color of unsweetened chocolate. He wore a worn, greasy baseball cap over his balding pate, the letters CAT barely visible beneath the grime. He held a large crescent wrench, gleaming in the harsh light of the three 100-watt bulbs suspended high overhead. Zeno was younger, 38, with his short black hair braided in tight cornrows. He had spent the better part of his adult life working menial jobs in a variety of marginal auto repair shops scattered across the north side of Lafayette. There he had picked up enough knowledge that his uncle, an old friend of Sam's, felt comfortable in recommending him to Sam, who then did the same with his boss as an assistant to help out with repairs on the heavy equipment. I, on the other hand, had graduated from Louisiana Technical College 2 years previously with a degree in heavy equipment repair, and with my more formal education, I had the luxury of having a number of jobs to pick from. Truth was, I would have been happier elsewhere, but the sugar mill was a family operation and had struggled in recent years to make ends meet. I felt something of an obligation to help out there, especially with harvest season coming on. Maybe when things calmed down and I had the opportunity to review my options more dispassionately, I could make a more rational and objective decision about my future. "Hey, Pops," Zeno always called the older man Pops. "I'm going to take a quick break and run outside to catch a smoke." Sam looked up at Zeno, a cautionary expression on his face. It wasn't that the younger man did not deserve a break. We had been working on the damn machine for over 3 hours, and were apparently no closer to getting it working than they had when they had started. "I wouldn't go out there. Not around the back of this building, I wouldn't." "What are you talking about, man?" Zeno was clearly getting frustrated. Sam looked back and forth at the two of us. "It's out there in the cane. Gotta be. About that time of year." And he went back to his work on the bulky engine. "What's out there?" "What you talking about, man?" he repeated. "Or do you just like to hear yourself talk?" The older man stopped and looked up at Zeno, pointing the end of his wrench at him. "I'm telling you, it's out there. You go out there and I can't help you if it comes for you." Now I was getting curious. I wasn't sure what the old man was referring to. It wasn't all that uncommon for people out here, especially old-timers, to have certain superstitions, but this was new to me. "What's out there? You haven't explained that to us." He began to tell his story. "It sleeps during the day," he began. "Can't nobody find it then. That's why nobody don't got no problem going into the field during the day. But come night, it comes out and run around in the fields. Lord help you if you out in the field and it finds you. Ain't nothing gonna be left of you. Everything. No clothes, no wallet, no nothing. I tell you, I seen it before, back in 1979. Me and Walter Wills was out here in the same building. Now, back then, they was storing barrels of syrup in here instead of tractors. It don't make no difference. And one night, Walter had to go back to the mill to fetch something he'd left. Except he decided to go out to the edge of that field there to pee. One second I look, and he was standing right there about to take a leak. Next second, he's gone. Nobody's seen him since." "Man, you crazy," Zeno told him, with a dismissive wave of his hand as he walked outside to smoke a cigarette. The breeze blew the cane stalks back and forth with a noisy rustle, and I saw a wisp of smoke from Zeno's cigarette drifting past the open door. Then I heard a sound that sent a chill running up my spine. What was so frightening was not the sound itself, but the fact that I had never heard anything like it before. I had heard many things out in the field surrounding the mill before, in addition to the normal crickets and cicadas. There were bullfrogs and owls, possums, snakes, maybe even an alligator, considering how close we were to the water. This was not like any of those. It was a low rumbling sound, like the engine of a large truck, but it definitely was not mechanical in nature. Whatever was making that sound was alive and possibly not of this earth. The sound increased in pitch and volume until suddenly it was replaced by a completely different roar, that of a diesel engine. Pops had gotten the old front-end loader running. Zeno reappeared in the opening just as the older man shut the engine down. He seemed out of sorts. I wondered if he too had heard the sound. Suddenly, from seemingly out of nowhere, a dark form appeared behind him. Though it had no definite form, I could never been so terrified of anything in my life. At first it was clear that Zeno knew something was very wrong, but he didn't know what. The fear that crossed his face was a mixture of confusion and dread. He started to scream, but was cut brutally short as the form seemed to merge with and envelop the man's body. All that escaped was a desperate gurgling sound, as his eyes swung wildly around, trying to focus on his attacker, but since it was only a large, dark mass with no discernible physical characteristics, he could mount no defense. There was no blood, no sign of physical injury, but clearly he was in distress. His mouth opened and closed, as if he was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Gradually the physical form of Gregory Zeno began to fade and became less distinct, seemingly being absorbed by this thing, and then he was gone, along with the thing. Naturally, we called the sheriff, but what could we say? If we told them what really happened, at best they'd think we were crazy. At worst, they would think we had something to do with his disappearance. We decided, the old man and I, that we would tell them the truth, to a point. Gregory Zeno had gone outside for a smoke, and simply disappeared. What could they say? There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no sign that anything at all was amiss, just another guy with a troubled past who simply decided to walk away from life. As the sheriff knew well, it happened more frequently than the public generally realized. I left that job after the harvest ended. No way was I going to go anywhere near the cane fields after dark, because whatever it was is still out there, lurking, under the Spanish moss. Twilight was beginning to fall, and the ancient cypress tree, majestically draped with Spanish moss, cast her long shadows across the surface of the water as I packed my rods and reels away and prepared to take my boat back to the landing. It had not been a particularly productive day of fishing in the Atchafalaya Basin, but, as often been said, a bad day fishing out here is better than a good day doing anything else. I had a single largemouth bass in the live well, and since I had plenty of fish in the freezer, it didn't make much sense to take him home with me and expend the effort scaling and cleaning him. I reached in and turned him loose. I figured at some point we'd meet again. I started the motor and moved forward slowly. The recent series of storms had raised the water level in the basin, and there were all manner of stumps and other obstacles that normally would have been visible but were now submerged. Hitting any one of them at high speed was not advisable. I noted that the murky water had the same hue as the dark roux my mama used to make when she cooked her gumbo. She had passed just last year, what I wouldn't have given to spend just one more day with her, watching her stirring endlessly over that cast-iron skillet. I made my way through the maze of little cuts and bayous that crisscrossed the basin, occasionally glancing back over the stern, watching the wake curl away from the parted water. The darkness deepened here, with the sky almost completely obscured by the canopy of tree branches overhead. Slowing to almost an idle, I realized that I was at the intersection where two bayous forked off in different directions. Normally I took the one on the left because the channel was wider and the water deeper, but I seemed to remember that if I took the one to the right, there was a cut about 500 yards up that normally would be too narrow and shallow to be navigable, but with the water level being what it was, it should be passable, and would easily shave 10 minutes off my travel time. Casting a glance back over the motor, I was about to head off to the right when I saw a small pirogue-like craft, maybe 50 yards astern from my position, cutting across the bayou and disappearing into the weeds along the shoreline. I squinted and cocked my head in puzzlement. When I had just passed by that area moments ago, I hadn't seen any coves or cuts that it would indicate where the boat might have come from, or gone to, and would surely have seen anything in the water. More usual than that was the passenger, who seemed to be rowing intently, head down, taking no notice of my presence. It appeared to be a young girl, certainly no older than a teenager, in a long white dress with long dark hair and white hair ribbons fluttering in the breeze. For a moment I was torn. She did not look to be in any distress or in need of assistance, but she certainly appeared out of place in terms of her style of dress, and it was getting awfully late for someone so young to be out there in the middle of nowhere. Reluctantly, I turned my boat around and headed back in that direction. Though I had been out here hundreds of times before, I didn't relish the thought of driving back to the landing in the dark. No telling what was liable to jump out at you when you couldn't see and anticipate. Approaching the area, I had seen the little boat. It seemed to have disappeared into thin air. I saw nothing that would indicate that it had even been there. It wasn't moored to anything on the shore or pulled up on the bank. It was just gone. I was about to write the whole thing off to my imagination when I noticed a slight disturbance in the weeds along the shoreline. Using the trolling motor to move in closer, I noticed that there was a small stream or creek that led off the bayou, the entrance to which was almost totally overgrown. I grabbed an oar and hacked some at the weeds and brush, and to my surprise, saw that it widened out a little ways in, at least enough that a small boat could pass. By now my initial reluctance had given way to curiosity. I had been up and down this bayou literally hundreds of times in the past, and had never noticed this place. It was too shallow to use the motor, so I pulled it out of the water and let the trolling motor take my bass boat along at a snail's pace along the little channel. I didn't see the pirogue or the girl ahead, but I knew she had to be there somewhere. There was no place else she could have gone. It was almost dark now, and I was beginning to get a little frightened. This little creek didn't seem to end, and even the most experienced swamp hand can tell you it gets a little spooky in the basin when night falls. There are all kinds of strange sounds, and the moonlight can play strange tricks on the eyes as it filters through the trees. Up ahead, there seemed to be a dim yellowish light glowing, and as I got closer I realized it must be someone's camp. It was certainly way out of the way, and I wanted to be careful. You didn't want to approach anyone's camp in the dark without identifying yourself first, and even then it was dicey. You could just as easily be greeted with a shotgun blast, and out here, it was unlikely anyone would ever find your body. I decided to chance it, since I didn't want to be left worrying whether something happened to the girl, especially when I was in a position to help. "Hello," I called out loudly. "I don't mean to disturb you, but I saw your daughter out here and it was getting dark. Just wanted to make sure she got home safely." There was no response from inside the structure, so I repeated myself, hoping the people inside spoke English. Sometimes out here, you could never be too sure. While the prevalence of French-only speakers wasn't nearly what it was even 50 years ago, you could still find a few random holdouts. My grandmother on my father's side, for example, knew English but spoke only French in her home till the day she died. I remember sitting round her big table at Christmas time while she told dirty jokes in French, and had all the relatives, except the children, who of course couldn't speak a word, in stitches. As I drifted up, I spotted the little pirogue I had seen earlier tied to one of the pilings. I looked up at the building, getting a good look at it for the first time, and was instantly suspicious. The place was dilapidated, nearly falling down, in fact. Surely no one could be living here. The light was still burning, its dim glow leaking out from the large gaps in the decayed plank siding. Something wasn't right. My first guess was that maybe I had stumbled upon some cookhouse that a couple of meth dealers had set up in an abandoned camp. Wouldn't be the first time that had happened. But if that was the case, then they surely weren't here now. If they had been, I would never have been allowed to get so close without being shot. My good sense told me to just get the hell out of there. The girl could be in serious danger. But the safest and smartest bet was to get back to the landing and call the sheriff. Let them deal with the criminals. Unfortunately, my conscience snagged at me. How could I leave knowing that a young girl was potentially in danger? Taking a deep breath, I retrieved my little .32 revolver I kept stowed under the console. I always carried it with me. You never knew what you might encounter in the swamp, and it always paid to be prepared. I had never had occasion to use it, but I was glad I had it with me now. The small gun didn't pack a very big punch, but it did make me feel safer to have it in my hand. Had the water level been lower, I would have had to work to hoist myself up onto the decking upon which the building rested, but as luck would have it, I was able to simply step over this side of the boat and up onto the dock. Nervously, I glanced around. This was getting creepier and creepier all the time. Who owned this place? Where was the little girl? The two small windows that faced the water might as well have not been there at all. They were so grimy that all I could see through them was a dim light near the center of the room. No wonder it had appeared so faint. As quietly as possible, I walked around the outside of the building, half expecting someone or something to jump out at me. As I rounded the back side, I noticed that the only door was slightly ajar. Was someone inside after all? It had to be the girl. She couldn't have gone anywhere else. Sticking the barrel of the revolver out in front of me, I used my free hand to ease the door open, half expecting to see the girl cowering in a corner. And who knew what else? To my utter shock, what I saw boggled the mind. Sitting round a rough-hewn table was what I could only assume was a family, consisting of a middle-aged woman, a man of roughly the same age, and the young girl I had seen rowing the pirogue, all eating dinner. There was an oil lamp burning brightly in the middle of the table. They didn't turn to look or even acknowledge my presence. They simply chatted softly amongst themselves in a Cajun French dialogue that I easily recognized from my childhood. Stranger still was the way that they were dressed. The girl was wearing the same simple white dress I had seen her wearing earlier. I was not close enough to see that it was probably made of cotton and most likely hand-sewn. The woman was similarly attired, though wore an old-fashioned bonnet upon her head and had a crocheted black shawl thrown around her shoulders. The mustached man wore a long-sleeved white shirt with a black vest and trousers. The entire ensemble looked as if they had just stepped out into a set of a movie about the original Cajun settlers of South Louisiana. As I started to back away, I heard the man say something and reach for something on the far side of the table. In doing so, his arm accidentally bumped against the oil lamp, tipping it over. What happened next is seared into my mind and was one of the most horrible things I have been witness to. As the lamp fell on its side, the contents of its fuel spilled across the surface of the table and splashed into the lap of the young girl. In almost an instant, she was engulfed in flames as the oil ignited, flashing across the table and onto the body of the girl. She shrieked in shock and pain and pushed away from the table, flapping her arms to try to put out the fire. Unsuccessful in her efforts, she bolted for the door and raced past, seeming not even to notice me standing there. I could see pain contorting her face as she ran by, and could sense the horror of her impending fate. She turned a corner, apparently heading for the water, and I waited for the impending splash to signal that she had jumped into the water. Hearing nothing, I ran around to the side of the shack, wondering if she had collapsed before she could make it to the water. She was gone. There was no body in the water or crumpled on the dock. In fact, no indication that anyone had been there at all. The night was completely still and not a sound could be heard. As I stood there, the sounds of insects and other animals slowly returned. To say I was stunned would be a vast understatement. Almost numbly, I returned to the rear of the little cabin. What would I say? What could I say to this family? I couldn't explain what happened myself. It was surreal, yet at the same time all too real. As I approached the door, I could sense a change before even looking inside. For one thing, the light was no longer burning. Of course, that was to be expected since the lamp had been knocked over. But when I looked inside, I could see from the ambient light offered by the full moon, now high in the sky, that it was completely empty. The man and woman I had seen moments ago were not just gone. It was clear they hadn't been there in a long time. The table and chairs, which stood still in the same place, were covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, which hung from the legs. The whole thing was incomprehensible. What was happening to me? I was beginning to question my sanity. What was real and what wasn't? This camp, or whatever it was certainly real. I could see it, touch it, feel the boards beneath my feet. The people I had seen, however, could not have existed, or at least no longer existed. I just knew I had to get out of there, lest I lose my sanity altogether. As I stepped back into my boat, I noticed that the pirogue was no longer tied to the piling. It too had disappeared. Using my trolling motor and the faint light provided by my onboard running lights, I made my way back toward the bayou. As I reached the mouth of the little creek and lowered the motor to start back to the landing, I turned back to look in the direction from which I had come. There in the distance I saw a dim yellowish light cutting through the darkness. Annabelle. I stepped out of my editor's office in a joyous mood. He had approved my story idea, the one I had been pitching for the last 6 months, and now I finally had my dream assignment. Maybe I just wore him down, but I'd like to think that he found real merit in the story. The concept had come to me last summer when my girlfriend and I were visiting the plantation homes along Louisiana's River Road. Along with the beautifully restored antebellum homes, we also noticed several other old mansions in various states of disrepair and dilapidation. I thought it might be interesting to the readers of our Southern Lifestyle magazine to investigate the origin of some of these old homes and give them a thumbnail sketch of their history. After all, everyone knew, or could find out, about the history of places like Oak Alley Plantation or Nottoway, but perhaps some of these other old places had histories that were just as interesting. As it turned out, for most of the homes, all I could find was property records at the courthouse. They contained the names of the past owners who sometimes led colorful lives, but there was precious little information about the properties themselves. I put together what I could, but was worried that what I had been able to dig up wouldn't be nearly enough to satisfy my editor. It would be bad enough that I had so little to show for my efforts, but what was potentially worse was that it might convince him that my ideas really weren't that great after all, and I'd be relegated back to covering holiday decorating tips from Mrs. Betty Lou Bush in Oxford, Mississippi. No offense to Mrs. Bush or Oxford, Mississippi. The fifth and final house on the list looked more promising. La Maison des Chênes, as it was known, was a Greek revival mansion, similar in appearance to Nottoway Plantation, but on a bit smaller scale. The property itself was overgrown with brush, and the building had fallen into a bad state, a fire clearly having ravaged the first floor. But looking at it under the majestic moss-draped oaks, you could still see glimpses of its former glory. In researching it, I found that there were news stories in the local papers about the home, and particularly about the fire that had occurred there. What made it more interesting was not what the stories said, but what they did not say. The stories indicated that there was indeed a fire that occurred in 1901 that started in the kitchen, doing significant damage to the house. There was, however, no mention as whether anyone was killed or injured. A former Army major named Lejeune owned the house at that time, and the subtext of the article was that Major Lejeune was a very prominent member of society who had the power to squash any official investigation into the cause of the fire or whether it caused any deaths or injuries. The problem was that unless I could find something more substantial, it wouldn't be enough to generate any real interest. I was about to admit defeat when I remembered an important detail. Just up the road and across the highway from the old maison stood an old bungalow that looked like it had been there for many years. The last time I had passed, there was an elderly woman tending the garden. She looked to be about 80 or 90 years old, and while she would not have been alive at the time of the fire, she may have known someone who was, or might have had some knowledge or background that could save my story. I climbed into my car and drove back to the little house, hoping the old woman was there. When I arrived, I noticed that while the house was quite old, it was exceptionally well kept. It had recently received a fresh coat of white paint, and the garden was neat, with colorful flowers blooming all around. I walked up the brick stairs to the porch and knocked on the door. It took several moments, but eventually I heard the lock turning, and the little old woman appeared behind the screen door. "Hi, my name is Kate Hebert," I said, introducing myself. "I'm with Gulf Coast Living magazine, and I'm doing a story on some of the old abandoned mansions along River Road. One of the homes on my list is La Maison des Chênes, just up the road there, and I was wondering if you would have any information that could help me." The old woman smiled. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Herbert. I'm Annabelle Arsenault. Being honest, I don't have many visitors. This day and age, you never do know what kind of people you're going to meet. But you look like a gentleman to me, she chuckled slightly. If you don't mind being a little warm, I'd be happy to sit for a while on the porch and visit. I'll fix us some lemonade and you can tell me what you're interested in knowing. I'd like that. As the old woman shuffled up the concrete steps and into the house, I wondered how long she had lived there. It suddenly hit me that there must be a Mr. Arsenault somewhere. I hadn't seen anyone other than the old lady, but that didn't mean he didn't exist. Mrs. Arsenault returned shortly, pushing an ancient tea cart, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses filled with ice. So, Mrs. Arsenault, I began, how long have you lived here? It's Miss, I'm afraid, she answered. What? Miss Arsenault, but please call me Annabelle. She paused briefly and grimaced slightly as if remembering something painful. I never married, no. My Wilfred and we were planning to get married, but he was killed in the army in 1950. He was in Korea, on the Choiseul Reservoir. I was never able to find anyone who measured up to him, and I wasn't ready to settle for just any man. I'm so sorry, I said, sympathizing with the old woman. Into every life, a little rain must fall, she sighed. But the Lord's been mighty good to me over the years, so I'm not complaining, you know. I've never spent a day in the hospital, not one. Never even seen a doctor going on 84 years now. That is amazing, I responded. Hardy woman, no doubt, from good stock. Much different from me. Seemed every time the seasons changed I was coming down with some sort of ailment or the other. I was doing some research on the house, I continued, getting to the point, and I found out that there was a fire there in 1901. Do you happen to know anything about a fire that happened there around that time? No, I wasn't around at the time, of course, but I remember what my mama told me about that many years later. She worked for Major Andre Lejeune, the man who used to own your house years ago, back when she was just a teenager. I nodded. Well, you probably don't know about the Major. He was real famous round here, fought with Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill, or so he claimed. He also claimed that he was relation to Marshal St. Pierre, the man that built the house back in the early 1800s, though I don't know the connection. His grandson, Alexander, the last St. Pierre to live in the house, died without an heir. Maybe there was a sister somewhere or a cousin. I don't know, really. Hit upon some hard times after the Civil War, but it seemed like it was coming back some by the time Major Lejeune moved in. Mama said he was shot in his left arm, that he was always complaining about it when it got cold around here. She also used to say he must have been hit in his head, too, because when he came back from the wars, he was all mean and crazy. Now, Mrs. Lejeune, she was different. She treated everybody kindly, didn't have nothing bad to say about no one. White, black, sharecropper, maid, they was all the same to her. That's why the children were always there. Mrs. Lejeune, they say she couldn't have children of her own, so she let the children come to the house and eat lunch in the kitchen downstairs, while their parents worked out in the fields or in the house. I tried to picture the scene in my mind. The old woman continued. I don't know that I should be telling this, but according to Mama, they said that Mr. Lejeune was having an affair with one of the women who worked in the kitchen, a black woman. Of course, they had both black and white women who worked in the kitchen. Ms. Lejeune wasn't one to make no distinctions on that. The Major wasn't so tolerant. Come to find out, the woman he was running around with ended up pregnant, and word was she had told more than one person that Mr. Lejeune was the father. When it got back to him, he decided he had to do something to make sure no one found out. From here, it's just guessing. She looked up at me with a faraway gaze. Can't say one way or the other, 'cause I wasn't there and neither was Mama. She was sick that day, and it's a good thing she was. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. But from what the police said later, it looked like the door up from the kitchen had been locked from the outside, and there was no way for the children who were eating in there or the kitchen helpers to get out when the fire started. Ain't none of 'em made it out. How did the fire start? I asked. No one really knows, Mrs. Annabelle said, shrugging her shoulders dismissively. Could have been an accident, I guess. But then it's awfully suspicious that that door was locked. Mama said no one had ever locked it before. So if several people died in the fire, how was it that it was never reported? Wasn't there an investigation? The old woman muttered dismissively. It's like I said. Major Lejeune was a powerful man around here. A few kitchen helpers and some sharecropper kids, that ain't nothing. Surely someone talked. Maybe not then, but later. From what I hear, a few dollars placed in the right hands and nobody knows nothing. Don't take much to improve the life of a sharecropper. So about their silence? I stood up, running a hand through my hair. This is amazing, I said, shaking my head. You want my advice? Mrs. Annabelle offered. You just leave it well enough alone. There's a lot of ghosts in that place. Been going on long before that fire. You don't want to be stirring up that evil. You know it feeds upon evil, changes people. But it's all in the past now, and everyone involved is dead by now. There can be no justice for those that are gone. If you do, it'll just eat you up like it did to Major Lejeune. Just like it did my mama. Sometimes it's better to just let old ghosts lie. I wish I could, Miss Annabelle. I wish I could, I replied, thinking about my story. You and me both, the older woman replied. I paused briefly, then straightened up, offering her my hand. It's been a great pleasure meeting you. I do have to get going, but I hope we can talk again sometime. Miss Annabelle rose too. You think about what I said now. You're a smart young man and full of life. I'd hate to see you dragged down by something that's long gone and in the past. I simply smiled in return as I headed down the steps toward the sidewalk. I noticed that I was down to a quarter of a tank as I pulled out of Miss Annabelle's gravel driveway, so I started back in the direction from which I had come. There was a little convenience store about a half-mile up the road where I could fill my tank. On the way back from filling up, a flash of lightning struck only a few yards from my ancient Volvo, immediately followed by a roar of thunder that rattled the windows and startled and frightened me to the point that I almost ran off the road. In the brief time that it had taken for me to gas up and get on back on the highway towards where the maison stood, the weather had changed dramatically. Such wild swings were not an uncommon summer phenomenon around these parts, as brief but severe afternoon storms swept inland from the Gulf of Mexico. But to me it seemed like supernatural forces were conspiring against me. Steeling myself, I drove onward, rounding the slight bend in the road that signaled the entrance to the old house. I stood looking round, expecting to see the Arsenault house looming up out of the rain any second. Had I not been paying attention, I would have missed it. As it was, I had driven half past it before I realized what I had done. I slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road, heedless to whether anyone was behind me or not. If anyone had been behind me, I would have been rear-ended for sure. I stared dumbfounded at the sight before me. The little house where I had just visited Annabelle Arsenault was gone, or nearly so. It had clearly been ravaged by fire, and not recently. In fact, the lot was overgrown with weeds and brush. The roof was collapsed and stray branches poked through a gaping blackened window frame. There was no traces of the garden that the old woman had so carefully tended, and the porch, where it had lemonade with her, was barely recognizable. Stunned, I pulled over to the side of the road so I would be out of harm's way and stared at what was left of the little bungalow. It was simply not possible that this was the same house I had visited just a few minutes ago. The rain had let some up, but it was still coming down, so I reached into the back seat and grabbed an umbrella. Checking for traffic, I stepped out of my car and hurried across the road to the remains of the little house stood. I tried to picture what I could remember of the house, but I just could not reconcile what I was looking at now with the way that it had been a short time ago. What had happened here? It just did not seem possible. Worse still, I could not accept that this damage had been done recently. It had to have taken years, possibly decades, for nature to have reclaimed this property so completely. I picked my way carefully up the walkway, mindful of the thorny vines that threatened to reach out and take hold of my jeans. The temperature had dropped several degrees, causing me to shiver in my short sleeves. As I mounted the stairs to climb onto the porch, a stiff breeze from off the river whipped by. The floor of the porch creaked under my weight, but seemed to be in fair shape relative to the rest of the place. Closing my umbrella, I tentatively made my way from window to window, peering in as if that would give me some insight as to what had happened. I wondered what had happened to Miss Annabelle. It was apparent that no one lived here anymore. I hadn't recalled the older woman mentioning any relatives, and I hoped that she hadn't ended up in a nursing home or something like that. Whatever infirmities she may have had, Miss Annabel seemed like a spry old woman. Those kinds of places were soul killers with their lack of freedom and endless hours spent under the watchful eyes of an ever-present but none too friendly staff of underpaid and overworked orderlies and nurses. Suddenly, I had an eerie feeling as if I was being watched. The chill I had felt earlier seemed to engulf my whole body, and I began to feel ill. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I reached out and grabbed the nearest post, hoping that it wouldn't collapse under my weight, taking what remained of the roof of the porch with it. I dropped to my knees and felt as if I was going to faint. Half crawling, I left my umbrella there and stumbled to the edge of the porch, willing myself to keep moving. If I could just get back to my car, I felt I could make it to the little store where I had filled up earlier. There I could at least get a bottle of water, and if need be they could call an ambulance if I felt myself getting worse. I was breathing hard by the time I reached my vehicle, but the worst of it appeared to have passed. I wasn't sure what had hit me, but I could almost swear that I felt a presence on that porch, and that somehow sensed that it was the presence of Annabel Arsenault. I had almost returned to normal when I turned into the oyster shell parking lot of Lulu's Gas and Grocery. A lighted marquee sign advertised live bait and boudin. Hopefully they were not one and the same. Walking through the light rain, I was too immersed in my own thoughts to even care. There was a jingle of a bell as I opened the door of the grocery, and a tall middle-aged man looked up briefly from the clipboard he was writing on, long enough to acknowledge my presence. "Afternoon," he nodded. I returned his greeting and headed back to the cooler, searching for the biggest bottle of water I could find. Truth was, I would have preferred one of the 24-ounce Bud Lights that was being advertised at 2 for $2.99, or perhaps something stronger, but I was driving and needed a clear head. I settled for a large bottle of Fiji water and had headed for the checkout. The guy up front, whose name tag identified him as Bubba, had finished whatever he was working on when I had come in and was waiting to check me out. "Quite a storm," he said casually. "Came up awful quick." "Yeah, it did," I smiled before continuing. "Hey, I was wondering. I was just up the road and I noticed that little house that was across the street from the old mansion that's overgrown had burnt down. When did that happen, and what happened to the lady that lived there?" "What, old lady Arsenault's house?" "Man, that house hasn't been lived in for at least 20 years. "That's impossible. I visited Annabel Arsenault just a little while ago." "Well, you would have had to visit her in the graveyard, because that's where she's been since her house burnt down." "I don't understand." "It's true. I was here when it happened. I was getting ready to close up for the night when some guy drove up here and said to call the fire department because the house up the road was on fire. I called up to Bob Duplantis' house because all we had at that time was a volunteer department, and Bob was the acting captain. He got his boys together and they came down in the truck, but by then it was too late. There was nothing left of the house by then. Found Mrs. Arsenault." "It's Miss," I interrupted. "Beg pardon," the cashier replied. "It's Miss Arsenault," I corrected. "She was never married." "Oh, okay. Miss Arsenault. Anyway, they found her body just inside the front door. Poor lady. Looked like maybe she'd been trying to get out, they said. I didn't really know her that well myself. I had just started working here, and she really didn't come in here that often. She usually did her grocery shopping somewhere else, I guess. She did keep her little place up real nice, though. She liked to garden." "And you're sure about all of this?" I insisted. "Of course, like I said. I was here when it happened," Bubba replied. "And no one has lived there in over 20 years? "Nope. Place was condemned by the parish. They would have torn it down, I guess, but money is tight, you know. I guess there wasn't enough left in her estate after she was gone to have it done, so it's just been sitting there like that." He shrugged his shoulders. I glanced outside. The rain had slowed to a slight drizzle, and the sky appeared to be clearing from the south. "Thanks," I said. I paid for the water and left. I didn't know what else to say. Of course, the man was right. There was no way that the house had burned so recently, and he had no reason to lie. But that only made things more confusing and more creepy. Maybe my story would be more interesting than I ever imagined. But would anyone believe me?